Once the house is sold, we can both move on. I knew you wouldn't fight me.
I'm not fighting.
The house isn't jointly owned. Then who owns it?
Timothy Clark was 44, a maintenance supervisor who spent more time repairing office buildings than talking about himself. His wife, Eleanor Clark, was a respected regional marketing director whose success everyone admired. Their neighbors believed Eleanor had built their comfortable life, while Timothy simply followed behind. Every weekday, he drove the same aging pickup, bought the same black coffee, and wore the same faded navy work jacket. What they didn't know was Timothy had quietly prepared for one day no husband ever wanted to face. Then he picked up the pen, signed the divorce papers without hesitation, and watched Eleanor smile seconds before a sealed property file slid across the polished oak table. If you're watching from somewhere in the world today, tell me your country and your local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're joining this story from. And if you enjoy slow-burning stories filled with unexpected twists and satisfying payoffs, consider subscribing so you won't miss tomorrow's story. The first time Timothy Clark met Eleanor Hayes, neither of them had any reason to imagine they would one day sit across from each other in a divorce attorney's conference room. It was the spring of 2008, and downtown Chicago was still recovering from the financial crisis. Timothy had volunteered on a Saturday with Habitat for Humanity, helping renovate a small brick house on the city's west side. He wore faded jeans, heavy work boots, and a white t-shirt stained with paint. He spent most of the morning replacing warped floorboards, while a group of volunteers painted walls and installed kitchen cabinets. Eleanor arrived just before noon. She represented the marketing department of a regional healthcare company that had sponsored the event. Unlike most of the volunteers, she looked as though she had come directly from an office. Her dark hair was neatly tied back. Her navy polo shirt carried the company's embroidered logo, and her clipboard never left her hands. She noticed Timothy only after watching him quietly solve a problem that had delayed the construction crew for nearly an hour. Instead of explaining what was wrong, he simply knelt beside the damaged joist measured twice, disappeared into the garage, returned with another beam, and fixed it without asking for recognition. When the project manager thanked him in front of everyone, Timothy merely nodded and went back to work. That was the first thing Eleanor admired about him. He never needed applause. Their first conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. "You make that look easy," Eleanor had said. Timothy smiled politely. "It only looks easy after making enough mistakes." She laughed. Most men tried too hard around her. Timothy barely tried at all. That quiet confidence intrigued her. Over the following months, they met several more times through volunteer events, coffee after work, and long walks along the Chicago Riverwalk. Eleanor loved talking about future promotions, new projects, and ambitious goals. Timothy listened carefully. He rarely interrupted. When he did speak, every sentence seemed considered before it left his mouth. Eleanor once joked that she spoke enough for both of them. Timothy simply smiled. Probably true. They married 2 years later inside a small stone church in Naperville. Neither came from wealthy families. Their wedding had fewer than 80 guests. The reception was held at a neighborhood country club rather than a luxury hotel. They danced until midnight. For years afterward, both believed they had found exactly the partner they needed. Eleanor's career accelerated almost immediately. She accepted increasingly demanding positions in healthcare marketing, eventually becoming regional marketing director for Lakeshore Health Systems, one of the largest private healthcare networks in northern Illinois. Her salary doubled, then doubled again. Business travel became routine. Dinner conversations often revolved around quarterly reports, executive meetings, and expansion strategies. Timothy's career looked far less impressive on paper. He remained a maintenance supervisor for Horizon Commercial Property Management, overseeing repairs for office buildings throughout DuPage County. He left home before sunrise. He inspected HVAC systems. He coordinated electricians. He fixed broken elevators. He responded to emergency plumbing calls. When tenants thanked him, he usually answered with the same phrase, "Happy to help." People noticed the difference. At neighborhood cookouts, conversations naturally gathered around Eleanor. "So, when's the next promotion? Did your company really buy another hospital? How many people report directly to you now?" Timothy usually stood near the grill flipping burgers. Nobody intentionally ignored him. They simply assumed his work wasn't interesting enough to ask about. He never corrected them. His pickup truck became part of his reputation. The dark blue Ford F-150 had nearly 200,000 miles on the odometer. The driver's seat showed cracks along the edge. The tailgate carried scratches from years of hauling lumber and drywall. Neighbors occasionally suggested he buy something newer. Timothy always answered the same way. "This one still starts every morning." Meanwhile, Eleanor drove a new luxury SUV every 3 years through her executive vehicle program. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Friends slowly began constructing a story that wasn't entirely true. Eleanor must be paying for everything. The house, the vacations, the landscaping, the renovations. Timothy probably earned enough to cover groceries and utilities. No one ever asked. No one ever checked. Assumptions quietly replaced facts. Among Eleanor's closest friends, none encouraged those assumptions more than Linda Foster. Linda had known Eleanor since business school. Confident, outspoken, and fiercely competitive, she admired success that could be measured in salaries, titles, and expensive handbags. Whenever Timothy quietly excused himself from conversations about corporate mergers or investment portfolios, Linda interpreted his silence as insecurity. One evening after a dinner party, she asked Eleanor while helping load dishes into the dishwasher, "Have you ever wished he'd do more?" Eleanor hesitated. "What do you mean? I don't know. Bigger career, better income, more ambition." Eleanor didn't answer immediately. That silence said enough. Linda continued, "You're carrying everything. Eventually that gets exhausting." Those words lingered longer than Eleanor admitted. Not because they were completely true, because they slowly became easier to believe. Meanwhile, Timothy's closest friend Greg Lawson saw something entirely different. Greg had worked beside Timothy for almost 15 years. Unlike everyone else, Greg occasionally noticed strange details. Timothy never seemed worried about money. He never complained about bills. He paid cash for equipment when everyone else financed purchases. He disappeared several evenings each month without explanation. When Greg asked once where he had gone after work, Timothy answered casually, "Looking at another building?" Greg assumed he meant another maintenance project. He never asked another question. Timothy preferred it that way. Home remained peaceful for many years. Saturday mornings meant pancakes. Sunday afternoons often meant gardening together. Every autumn, they decorated the front porch with pumpkins and mums. Their 2-story colonial on Maple Ridge Drive became one of the best-kept homes in the subdivision. Neighbors admired its stone entryway, mature oak trees, and perfectly maintained lawn. Eleanor proudly referred to it as the reward for years of hard work. Timothy never corrected that description. Not once. As Eleanor's responsibilities increased, however, something subtle began changing. She spent more evenings entertaining executives. Timothy was invited less often. She began buying him new dress shirts before corporate dinners. "You'll look more professional in this one." She encouraged him to trade his pickup for something newer. "It reflects on both of us." She gently suggested he stop wearing work boots into restaurants after long shifts. They're covered in dust. Each request sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they slowly communicated something else. Who Timothy was no longer fit the image Eleanor wanted beside her. He noticed. He simply chose not to argue. Silence had become his habit long before it became his strategy. Then Daniel Whitmore entered the picture. Daniel was Lakeshore Health System's newly appointed Senior Vice President of Business Development. Tall, polished, and endlessly charismatic, he possessed the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms and expensive hotels. He complimented Eleanor's presentations, requested her opinions during executive meetings, invited her to strategy dinners after conferences. His attention arrived gradually enough that few questioned it. Timothy certainly didn't. He trusted Eleanor completely. At least he wanted to. One rainy Thursday evening, Eleanor arrived home nearly 2 hours later than expected. She placed her briefcase on the kitchen island. Didn't remove her coat. Didn't ask about Timothy's day. Instead, she stood quietly for several seconds, looking toward the window. Finally, she spoke. "I met with an attorney today." Timothy slowly set down the coffee mug in his hands. He looked at her without anger, without confusion, without panic. She continued before he could answer. "Her name is Rebecca Sloan." The room fell silent. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, Timothy understood something had ended long before Eleanor found the words to say it. Timothy did not answer immediately. The rain continued tapping against the kitchen windows while Eleanor stood with her arms folded, waiting for a reaction she had already rehearsed in her mind. An argument, questions, accusations, perhaps even pleading. Instead, Timothy looked down at the coffee growing cold in his mug. His fingers rested quietly around the handle before he set it on the granite countertop with deliberate care. "When do you want me to move out?" he asked. The question caught Eleanor off guard. "I've already arranged a furnished apartment," she replied after a pause. "It's available this weekend." He nodded once. "All right." That was all. No raised voice, no desperate negotiation, no attempt to remind her of birthdays, anniversaries, or promises spoken years earlier beneath stained glass windows inside a small church. The silence unsettled Eleanor more than anger would have. She had prepared herself to defend the decision. Timothy never forced her to. The next 3 days passed with almost mechanical precision. Timothy packed only what belonged to him: his clothes, his tools, a framed photograph of his late parents, several worn notebooks, one old leather folder that had remained inside the bottom drawer of his desk for more than a decade. Everything else stayed exactly where it had always been. Neighbors noticed the pickup truck backed into the driveway on Saturday morning. Greg Lawson happened to drive past while taking his grandson to a baseball game. He slowed for a moment. Timothy was loading 2 storage bins into the truck. Greg parked along the curb. "You moving?" Timothy smiled faintly. "For a little while?" Greg studied his friend's face. No bitterness, no panic. Just exhaustion hidden beneath composure. "You need help." "I appreciate it." "You sure?" "I'm sure." Greg wanted to ask more. Instead, he reached into the truck bed, picked up a heavy toolbox, and secured it with a cargo strap. The 2 men finished loading in less than 20 minutes. Before leaving, Greg placed one hand on Timothy's shoulder. "If you need anything." "I know." Timothy drove away without looking back. The furnished apartment sat above a quiet insurance office in downtown Geneva, Illinois, about 35 minutes west of Naperville. It wasn't luxurious. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, simple oak furniture, white walls, a small balcony overlooking 3rd Street. The building smelled faintly of fresh paint and brewed coffee from the cafe downstairs. For the first time in years, Timothy found himself completely alone. He unpacked carefully. Each item had its place. The photograph of his parents rested beside the bed. His work boots lined up neatly near the door. The leather folder disappeared into the top shelf of the bedroom closet. He stood in the center of the apartment after everything was finished. Silence filled every room. Not the uncomfortable silence that had gradually settled over his marriage. A different kind. The silence of beginning again. Monday morning arrived exactly as every Monday had for nearly 2 decades. Timothy woke at 5:10, made black coffee, ironed his work shirt, drove to Horizon Commercial Property Management. No one at work knew he had separated from his wife. He intended to keep it that way. His crew gathered around the maintenance board at 6:30. Broken rooftop unit, leaking sprinkler pipe, electrical inspection, routine assignments. Timothy divided the work calmly. Mike, Building 3. Jason, handled the elevator inspection. I'll take Riverside Plaza. Nobody noticed anything unusual. By lunchtime, Timothy had repaired a damaged air handler that another contractor estimated would require complete replacement. The building manager thanked him repeatedly. You probably saved us $15,000. Timothy shrugged. It only needed a bearing. The manager laughed. You always see something everyone else misses. Those words stayed with him longer than the manager realized. Seeing what others overlooked had become almost instinct. It had not begun with maintenance work. It had begun when Timothy was 15 years old. His father, Richard Clark, owned a small construction company outside Joliet. The business had supported the family comfortably for years. Nothing extravagant, just steady work. Then Richard accepted a partnership with a longtime friend. The paperwork seemed simple. The promises sounded sincere. The signatures came quickly. The consequences arrived slowly. By the time Richard discovered loans had been secured against company assets without his full understanding, the business was already collapsing. The bank foreclosed. Equipment disappeared. The family sold their home within 6 months. Timothy never forgot watching his father carry the last cardboard box into a rented moving truck. His father did not cry. He simply looked at the empty driveway and said something Timothy would remember for the rest of his life. Trust people if they've earned it. He paused. But always trust paperwork more. At 15, Timothy barely understood the legal meaning behind those words. At 44, he lived by them. After work that Monday, Timothy did not return directly to Geneva. Instead, he drove into downtown Chicago. The traffic along Interstate 88 crawled as commuters filled every lane. He arrived shortly before 5 o'clock at an older limestone office building overlooking the Chicago River. The brass directory listed only professional firms, architects, accountants, estate planners. On the 9th floor, a receptionist greeted him warmly. Good afternoon, Mr. Clark. Good afternoon, Sandra. Miss Donovan is expecting you. Margaret Donovan had practiced estate and trust law for more than 30 years. Judges respected her. Bank executives listened carefully whenever she spoke. Clients rarely left her office without several pages of handwritten notes. She also possessed one habit Timothy appreciated more than any other. She never rushed. Her office reflected the same philosophy. Dark walnut bookshelves reached the ceiling. Leather-bound legal volumes lined every wall. A grandfather clock ticked steadily near the window, overlooking the river. Margaret stood as Timothy entered. You've lost weight. I've had a busy week. I imagine you have. They shook hands before sitting across a polished conference table. She slid a yellow legal pad toward herself. Tell me everything. Timothy described Eleanor's announcement, the apartment, the divorce attorney, the planned uncontested filing. Margaret listened without interrupting. Occasionally, she wrote a single sentence. Nothing more. When Timothy finished, the room became quiet. Margaret removed a pair of reading glasses from her desk. I reviewed every trust document this morning. And nothing has changed. She opened a thick blue binder. Inside were carefully tabbed sections: trust agreements, property deeds, operating agreements, title insurance, tax records, every page organized chronologically. You've maintained everything exactly as we discussed over the years. Timothy nodded. I tried. You did more than try. She turned several pages. Every amendment. Another page. Every acquisition. Another. every annual report. Finally, she stopped. This is why discipline matters. Timothy looked towards the window. I never expected to use any of it. Most people don't. Margaret closed the binder gently. They prepare for retirement. They prepare for illness. They rarely prepare for disappointment. Timothy allowed himself a faint smile. I was hoping you'd tell me I'd over-prepared. Margaret smiled back. There is no such thing. She reached for another folder resting beside the binder. Unlike the first, this one contained only a handful of documents. Original signatures, county recording stamps, certified copies. She examined one page more carefully than the others. Her expression changed, almost imperceptibly. Not concern, curiosity. She adjusted her glasses. Timothy. Yes. Has Eleanor ever asked to see the original ownership documents for the Maple Ridge property? He thought for a moment. No. Not once. No. Margaret slowly placed the document back inside the folder. Then she folded her hands together across the table. That may become far more important than either of us expected. Timothy looked at the closed folder, but did not reach for it. For the first time since leaving his home, he sensed the divorce might not unfold the way everyone assumed. 3 days later, Eleanor officially filed for divorce in DuPage County. The petition arrived at Timothy's office just after 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning. A receptionist from the property management company carried the certified envelope into the maintenance department. Tim, this came by courier. Thank you. He signed the delivery receipt with the same calm expression he used when approving repair invoices. His crew continued replacing ceiling tiles down the hallway. No one paid attention. Timothy slipped the envelope into his briefcase without opening it. He finished inspecting a rooftop cooling tower before driving home that evening. Only after changing into jeans and making himself dinner did he finally sit at the small dining table in his apartment. Outside downtown Geneva had settled into its usual quiet rhythm. The bookstore across the street switched off its lights. The cafe downstairs closed at 7. A freight train sounded somewhere beyond the Fox River. Timothy carefully broke the seal on the envelope. Inside were nearly 60 pages. Petition for dissolution of marriage, financial disclosure requests, property schedules, temporary arrangements, instructions from Eleanor's attorney. Every page smelled faintly of fresh toner. He read the first paragraph, then the second. He never skipped ahead. Years of reading contracts before signing maintenance agreements had taught him one habit. Small sentences often carried the largest consequences. By the time he finished, almost 2 hours had passed. Nothing in the petition surprised him. Irreconcilable differences, request for equitable division, disposition of marital residence, retirement accounts, household furnishings. Everything appeared routine, except one sentence. It appeared halfway through the section describing marital assets. The marital residence located on Maple Ridge Drive shall be sold and the net proceeds divided equally between the parties. Timothy read that sentence twice, then a third time. His expression never changed. Instead, he reached for his phone. Margaret Donovan answered after the second ring. I was expecting your call. You've seen it. Rebecca Sloan sent me a courtesy copy this afternoon. What do you think? I think assumptions have already entered the case. Timothy remained quiet. Margaret continued. Don't respond tonight. I wasn't planning to. Good. What comes next? I'll prepare our response. She paused. But first I want every supporting document. You already have most of them. Most isn't all. She began listing them slowly. Latest county tax assessment. Timothy wrote it down. Utility payment history. Another note. Insurance renewals. He continued writing. Original trust certification. Recorded warranty deed. Title insurance policy. Mortgage satisfaction documents. She finished with one final request. And I want every annual statement from Clark Legacy Property Trust. Timothy looked toward the bedroom closet where the leather folder rested. I can have everything tomorrow. I know you can. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Neither mentioned Eleanor. Neither discussed emotions. Only documents. The following afternoon, Timothy drove back into Chicago carrying 2 banker's boxes. Margaret's paralegal, Susan Whitaker, met him in the conference room. Susan had worked with Margaret for nearly 20 years. She organized paperwork with military precision. Colored tabs, chronological folders, cross-referenced indexes. She opened the first box. I've never seen anyone keep records this complete. Timothy smiled. My father taught me. Susan picked up a folder labeled Property Taxes. Every year separated. Every receipt preserved. Another folder contained insurance renewals. Another held renovation permits dating back more than a decade. Nothing appeared out of place. Margaret entered carrying coffee. She glanced over the growing stacks of paperwork. This, she said quietly, is how cases are won before they ever reach a courtroom. Timothy sat across from her. I still don't understand why everyone's acting like the house belongs to both of us. Margaret leaned back. Because that's what they believe. And they're wrong. They may be. She emphasized the final word carefully. Belief isn't evidence. For the next hour, they reviewed every page together. Margaret rarely commented. Occasionally, she circled a paragraph. Sometimes she attached a sticky note. Once she smiled to herself after comparing 2 dates. Finally, she closed the last folder. I found something. Timothy looked up. What? Not a problem. A pattern. She placed 2 documents side by side. One was Eleanor's financial disclosure. The other was an older trust amendment. Notice the language. Timothy studied them. One document repeatedly referred to the Maple Ridge property as jointly owned. The trust amendment never did. Instead, every reference described the property as an asset held by Clark Legacy Property Trust. Margaret tapped the page gently. Words matter. Timothy nodded slowly. So Rebecca never checked. I don't think she did. Why? Margaret folded her hands. Because she accepted her client's understanding instead of verifying the public record. Timothy looked thoughtful. That's unusual. It happens more often than you'd imagine. Across town, Eleanor sat inside Rebecca Sloane's downtown law office, reviewing preliminary settlement projections. Rebecca Sloane had built her reputation on efficient divorces involving executives and business owners. Confident, organized, sharp in negotiation. She scanned a spreadsheet while speaking. The process should be straightforward. Eleanor relaxed slightly. That's good. Rebecca nodded. Your husband appears cooperative. He won't fight. Rebecca smiled. Most people say that. No. Eleanor shook her head. You don't know Timothy. He avoids conflict. He always has. Rebecca made another note. That generally works in everyone's favor. Eleanor believed it. For years, Timothy had accepted every compromise. Vacation destinations, furniture, career moves, holiday schedules. He almost never insisted on getting his way. This divorce, she assumed, would be no different. Rebecca continued reviewing projected assets. The largest issue is obviously the residence. The house. Yes. Once it's sold, everything else becomes relatively simple. Eleanor nodded. I agree. Neither woman questioned the assumption. Meanwhile, Daniel Whitmore received a phone call while leaving Lakeshore Health System's executive offices. Eleanor filed. He smiled after hearing the answer. Good. The man on the other end asked another question. No, Daniel replied confidently. I don't expect complications. He ended the call and walked toward the parking garage. To Daniel, Timothy Clark barely existed, A maintenance supervisor, an aging pickup, work boots, quiet personality, not someone capable of creating legal obstacles. Appearances had already convinced him. Late Friday afternoon, Margaret finalized the formal response. She slid the completed packet across the conference table toward Timothy. "I've addressed every issue except one." "The house," she nodded. Intentionally. Timothy looked surprised. "You didn't dispute it?" "Not yet." "Why?" Margaret smiled patiently. "Sometimes the strongest move is allowing the other side to become comfortable." She stood and walked toward the office window. "The more confident they become, the less carefully they'll examine their own assumptions." Timothy considered her words. "So we wait." "For now." She turned back toward him. "When Rebecca requests mediation, you'll attend." "I will. When she asks if you're prepared to sign preliminary agreements." "I'll say yes." Margaret smiled again. "Exactly. No threats, no dramatic letters, no accusations, just patience." Before leaving, Timothy stopped beside the conference room door. "Margaret?" "Yes." "If they ask me directly whether I'll contest anything." "What will you answer?" He thought for a moment. "The truth." "And what's that?" "I haven't decided." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Good." Outside Chicago's evening traffic stretched for miles beneath gray autumn skies. Timothy drove west without turning on the radio. His thoughts remained steady. The divorce itself no longer frightened him. People could leave. Relationships could end. Promises could break. His father had taught him that painful truth years ago. But paperwork remembered everything. 5 days later, Rebecca Sloan called Margaret's office. She sounded unusually cheerful. "My client would like to schedule mediation as soon as possible." Margaret glanced toward Timothy, who happened to be reviewing maintenance reports in the adjoining conference room. "I believe that can be arranged," Rebecca continued. "Given Mr. Clark's cooperation, I don't anticipate any major disagreements." Margaret allowed herself the smallest smile. "Neither do I." After the call ended, she looked toward the closed blue folder resting on her desk. Inside lay one certified document that no one on the other side had bothered to request. Not yet. And until they did, every conversation about selling the house rested on an assumption that had never been tested against the official record. 12 years before the divorce papers ever appeared on Timothy Clark's kitchen table, Maple Ridge Drive was little more than a quiet street lined with half-finished dreams. The neighborhood sat on the western edge of Naperville, where new subdivisions were slowly replacing old farmland. Construction had stalled after the housing market collapsed, leaving several completed homes standing beside empty lots overgrown with weeds. Most buyers stayed away. Banks were anxious. Developers were desperate. Timothy saw something different. One chilly October afternoon in 2014, he drove through the neighborhood after finishing an emergency repair at a nearby office complex. A handwritten sign leaned against the front lawn of a 2-story colonial. Bank owned. Price reduced. The house needed work. The front porch railing had begun to separate from its posts. Several shutters hung crooked. The landscaping had been abandoned for months. But the foundation looked solid. The roof was newer than expected. The brick exterior showed almost no structural damage. Timothy parked his truck and walked slowly around the property. He carried no measuring tape, no clipboard. Years of maintenance work had trained his eyes well enough. He could estimate repair costs simply by observing details. Loose flashing, uneven gutters, water stains, foundation settlement. Every house told a story. This one wasn't broken. It had simply been abandoned. That evening, Timothy drove somewhere Eleanor never knew existed, not because he intended to hide it. She had simply never asked. The office occupied the second floor of a restored brick building in downtown Wheaton. Its sign was modest: Anderson and Pierce Commercial Realty. Inside, broker Thomas Anderson greeted Timothy with a smile. "You're back," I wanted another look at Maple Ridge. Thomas laughed softly. I thought you might. You've been watching it? For 3 weeks, Thomas opened a property file. The bank keeps lowering the price. Any offers? None that survived inspection. Timothy nodded. What are they asking now? Thomas slid a printed sheet across the desk. The number was nearly 20% lower than similar homes nearby. Thomas leaned forward. The lender wants it off the books before the end of the quarter. Timothy studied the photographs carefully. He asked questions most buyers ignored. When was the furnace installed? What year is the water heater? Any drainage reports? Original construction permits? Thomas smiled. You always ask different questions. Timothy answered quietly. Cosmetic problems are expensive if you don't understand structure. The following week, Timothy met Margaret Donovan. At that time, they had already worked together for several years. Their conversations rarely lasted long. Most ended with Margaret asking one simple question. What are you trying to accomplish 10 years from now? Timothy always answered before discussing numbers. Security. Never luxury, never status, just security. Margaret listened while reviewing the purchase proposal. You intend to live there? Eventually. She looked up. Eventually. I'd like to own it first. Margaret waited. Timothy continued. I don't want my home to become someone's financial target someday. Margaret remained silent. He added another sentence. My father lost everything because he believed ownership and paperwork were the same thing. They aren't. Margaret nodded slowly. They're very different. She opened another folder already waiting on her desk. Across the top appeared a familiar name. Clark Legacy Property Trust. The trust itself had existed for years. Timothy established it long before meeting Eleanor. Originally, it held only a small duplex outside Aurora that Timothy purchased after years of disciplined saving. Every rental payment had remained inside the trust. Every repair had been documented. Every dollar reinvested. Slowly, patiently, the trust grew stronger. Never dramatically, never quickly, just steadily. Margaret pointed toward one paragraph. If the trust purchases the property, the legal owner remains the trust. Timothy nodded. I understand. You would remain trustee. I understand. The residence can still become your marital home. I understand. She folded her hands. But ownership doesn't automatically change simply because someone lives there. Timothy looked at the paperwork. I don't want to deceive anyone. Margaret's expression became firm. Then don't. Be completely transparent if anyone ever asks. Timothy agreed immediately. I will. The closing took place 6 weeks later. No celebration, no champagne, just signatures, certified documents, wire transfers, a county recording stamp. The warranty deed transferred ownership directly into Clark Legacy Property Trust. Timothy signed only in his capacity as trustee. Nothing unusual, nothing secret. Everything recorded exactly as Illinois law required. After renovations were completed, Timothy and Eleanor moved into the house. She loved it immediately. The wide staircase, the stone fireplace, the backyard shaded by mature maple trees. She spent weekends choosing paint colors and furniture. Timothy spent evenings rebuilding the deck and installing new lighting himself. Together, they transformed the property into a beautiful home. Neighbors complimented Eleanor's decorating. They admired the flower beds she designed. Holiday parties became annual traditions. Children carved pumpkins in the driveway every October. Friends gathered around the fireplace every Christmas. The house slowly became associated with Eleanor. Not because she owned it, because she gave it personality. Timothy appreciated that. He never corrected anyone who complimented her taste. Years passed. Mortgage payments disappeared automatically from an account managed through the trust. Property taxes were paid on schedule. Insurance renewed annually. Maintenance remained meticulous. Everything functioned so smoothly that Eleanor never questioned any paperwork. Whenever renewal notices arrived, Timothy handled them. Not because he wanted control, because paperwork had always been his responsibility. The arrangement felt natural, until it became invisible. One summer evening several years after moving in, Linda Foster admired the backyard during a barbecue. "I swear," she laughed. "Eleanor, this house looks like something out of a magazine." Eleanor smiled proudly. "We've worked hard." Linda glanced toward Timothy, who was repairing a loose fence gate with a cordless drill. "You definitely married someone useful." Everyone laughed, including Timothy. He tightened the final screw before walking back toward the grill. No offense had been intended. None was taken. Yet moments like that accumulated quietly over the years. Small assumptions, small jokes, small misunderstandings, each one reinforcing the same story. Eleanor earned success. Timothy maintained it. Neither corrected the narrative. One evening, Greg Lawson stopped by unexpectedly to borrow a trailer. While waiting in the garage, he noticed several thick binders stored neatly on industrial shelving. "Man," Greg joked, "you've got more paperwork than my accountant." Timothy smiled. "I like keeping records." "For what?" "Everything." Greg shook his head. "I throw receipts away after 6 months. My father used to say paper has a better memory than people." Greg laughed. "Sounds like your old man." He thought nothing more about it. Back in the present, Margaret Donovan spread several documents across the conference table. Timothy sat opposite her, while Susan Whitaker organized certified copies beside each folder. Margaret pointed to the original recorded deed. "This is the first link." Then another. "The trust certification." Another. "The county recording receipt." Another. "The property tax records." Every document connected perfectly. No missing years, no unexplained transfers, no hidden ownership changes. Just one uninterrupted chain of legal documentation stretching back 12 years. Susan looked genuinely impressed. "I've reviewed thousands of property files." She looked toward Timothy. "I've never seen one maintained this carefully." Timothy shrugged modestly. "I didn't know whether I'd ever need it." Margaret answered before Susan could. "That's exactly why it matters." She reached for one final envelope, bearing the seal of the DuPage County Recorder's Office. "It arrived this morning." She carefully opened it. Inside rested freshly certified ownership records. Margaret reviewed the first page, then the second. Satisfied, she placed them back into the envelope without another word. Timothy noticed the slight change in her expression. "Everything all right?" She looked directly at him. "Better than all right." "What does it say?" Margaret smiled faintly. "It confirms exactly what I expected." She tapped the sealed envelope once with her fingertips. "The problem is," she paused deliberately, "Rebecca Sloan hasn't requested these records." Timothy frowned. "Not yet." "No." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "And until she does, she is negotiating a house she believes belongs to 2 people. She rested her hand lightly on the envelope. "When the official county records continue to recognize only one legal owner." The room fell silent. Outside the office windows, the Chicago skyline glowed beneath the last light of sunset. Inside, the certified documents remained unopened on the conference table, waiting for the moment when assumption would finally collide with recorded fact. The mediation conference was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning inside a law office overlooking Wacker Drive in downtown Chicago. Timothy arrived 20 minutes early. Not because he was nervous, because he had never liked making other people wait. He parked his aging pickup in a public garage 6 blocks away instead of using the valet service outside the building. His faded navy work jacket had been replaced by a charcoal suit that had hung untouched in his closet for years. It fit well, though it lacked the tailored elegance of the expensive suits worn by most of the attorneys walking through the lobby. He carried only a slim leather portfolio, nothing more. Margaret Donovan arrived a few minutes later. "You slept? Enough. You ready?" Timothy looked toward the elevators. "I've been ready for a long time." Margaret nodded. "Good." On the 12th floor, Rebecca Sloan was already arranging documents across the conference table. Everything appeared perfectly organized. Settlement proposal, asset schedules, retirement summaries, vehicle valuations. A separate folder labeled Marital Residence rested neatly beside Eleanor's chair. Eleanor looked confident. She wore an ivory pantsuit, pearl earrings, and the same composed expression she used before important corporate presentations. Daniel Whitmore was not present. Officially, he had no role in the proceedings. Unofficially, Eleanor had spoken with him twice that morning. His last text message still sat unread near the top of her phone. Everything will be over today. Rebecca stood as Timothy and Margaret entered. "Good morning." Margaret smiled politely. "Rebecca." The introductions were brief, coffee was poured, legal pads were opened. The mediator retired Judge Samuel Pierce entered exactly at 9. He greeted each person before taking his seat. "Our goal today is resolution." Everyone nodded. Judge Pierce looked first toward Timothy. "Mr. Clark, are you prepared to proceed?" "Yes." "No objections to beginning?" "None." The judge seemed pleasantly surprised. Many divorce mediations began with hostility before the first page was discussed. This room felt unusually calm. Rebecca presented Eleanor's proposal first. She spoke confidently. "The parties have agreed on division of personal property." She turned another page. "Retirement accounts have already been evaluated." Another page. "Vehicles will remain with their current drivers." Everything progressed smoothly. Timothy listened without interruption. Whenever Judge Pierce asked whether he understood a provision, Timothy answered simply. "Yes." Nothing more. Rebecca grew increasingly comfortable. She interpreted every calm response as agreement. Finally, she reached the largest asset. The marital residence located on Maple Ridge Drive. She slid the settlement page toward the center of the table. "Our proposal remains straightforward. The property will be listed for sale within 30 days. Net proceeds will be divided equally." Judge Pierce looked toward Timothy. "Mr. Clark?" Timothy glanced once towards Margaret. She gave the slightest nod. He looked back at the judge. "I'm willing to sign today's agreement." Rebecca smiled. Eleanor relaxed visibly. For the first time all morning, the tension in her shoulders eased. Judge Pierce picked up his pen. "Excellent." Rebecca pushed the document across the polished oak table. Timothy signed every page carefully. His signature remained steady. No hesitation. No corrections. Each page turned quietly, one after another. When the final signature was complete, Rebecca gathered the paperwork with obvious satisfaction. "I believe that concludes the matter." Margaret spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. "Not quite." Rebecca looked up. "Is there something else?" "There is one document that should become part of today's record." Rebecca frowned slightly. "What document?" Margaret reached into her briefcase. Instead of removing a thick binder, she withdrew a single sealed envelope bearing the certification stamp of the DuPage County Recorder's Office. She placed it gently in front of Judge Pierce. No one objected to verifying title ownership. Rebecca's smile faded only slightly. "That isn't necessary." Margaret remained composed. "I believe it is." Judge Pierce examined the envelope. "Certified copies." "Yes, Your Honor." "Current." "Recorded and certified last week." The judge broke the seal. The room became noticeably quieter. Only the soft sound of paper sliding across the table, interrupted the silence. He reviewed the first page, then another. His eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. Rebecca noticed. "Is there a problem?" Judge Pierce did not answer immediately. Instead, he handed the first document across the table. "You may wish to read this." Rebecca accepted the page confidently. Within seconds, the confidence disappeared. She turned back to the heading, then to the legal description, then to the ownership section. She read it again, very slowly. Her eyes stopped on one line. Current legal owner, Clark Legacy Property Trust. Trustee Timothy Clark. Rebecca immediately reached for the second page. Recording history, original deed, transfer records, no conveyance to Timothy individually, no conveyance to Eleanor, no joint tenancy, no tenancy by the entirety, no post-marital transfer. Everything matched, every recording dated, every signature notarized, every filing complete. Across the table, Eleanor watched Rebecca's expression change. "What is it?" Rebecca didn't answer. She continued reading. Margaret quietly slid another certified copy toward Judge Pierce. "This is the original warranty deed." Another. "The trust certification." Another. "The complete chain of title." Judge Pierce compared the documents carefully. "They're consistent." "They are," Margaret replied. Rebecca finally looked toward Eleanor. "When did you receive title to the property?" Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean? Did Timothy ever execute a deed transferring ownership? No? Did you?" "No." Rebecca looked back down at the paperwork. The answer had already been sitting in front of her. She had simply never requested it. Eleanor's voice grew quieter. "I don't understand," Margaret answered calmly. "You lived in the residence. That does not necessarily determine legal ownership." Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. A mistake? Not in the law. In preparation. She had relied on assumptions that should have been verified before mediation was ever scheduled. Judge Pierce folded his hands. "It appears the property is not titled as described in the proposed settlement." "No," Margaret said. "It is not." Silence settled across the conference room. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, traffic continued moving along the Chicago River as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside, everything had changed. Eleanor slowly turned toward Timothy. For the first time since filing for divorce, uncertainty replaced confidence. She searched his face for anger, for satisfaction, for revenge. She found none of them. Timothy simply sat quietly with his hands folded on the table. He had signed every page without argument, exactly as everyone expected. But the moment the certified title records appeared, the negotiation they thought had already ended had quietly begun all over again. For nearly a full minute, no one spoke. Judge Samuel Pierce slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them on the conference table. Years on the bench had taught him that silence often revealed more than questions. Rebecca Sloan finally broke it. "I'd like a short recess." Judge Pierce nodded. 15 minutes. Everyone stood. Eleanor followed Rebecca into a smaller conference room across the hall without saying a word. The moment the door closed, she turned toward her attorney. "What just happened?" Rebecca remained standing beside the window, still holding the certified title documents. "I should have requested these before today." "You mean?" "The house is legally owned by Clark Legacy Property Trust." Eleanor frowned. "Timothy owns the trust." "Not exactly." Rebecca chose her words carefully. "Timothy is the trustee." "That distinction matters." Eleanor stared at her. "But we lived there." "Yes." "I paid bills." "Yes." "I decorated it." "Yes." Rebecca sighed. "None of those facts automatically determine legal title." Eleanor shook her head. "This doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to make sense emotionally. It has to make sense legally. For the first time since deciding to end her marriage, Eleanor felt the ground beneath her assumptions begin to shift. She remembered moving into the house, painting bedrooms, planting hydrangeas, choosing kitchen countertops, hosting Christmas dinners. Every memory felt undeniably real. Yet not one of those memories answered the simplest legal question: who actually owned the property? Across the hallway, Timothy remained seated. Margaret quietly poured coffee into 2 paper cups. "You handled that well." "I didn't do anything." "You did exactly what you needed to do." Timothy looked through the window toward the river. "I never wanted today to feel like winning." Margaret handed him the coffee. "Good? Because that's not what this is." He accepted the cup. "I spent 18 years with Eleanor." "I know. I don't enjoy watching her surprised." Margaret studied him for a moment. "That's one of the reasons I've respected you for so many years." Timothy gave a faint smile. "I assume this isn't over." "Not even close." She opened her notebook. "They're going to ask questions." "What kind?" "Every kind." Timothy nodded. "I'll answer them." "I know you will." 15 minutes later, everyone returned to the main conference room. Rebecca's confidence had been replaced by professional caution. She no longer assumed anything. Judge Pierce resumed the session. "Counsel," Rebecca cleared her throat, "in light of the newly presented documents, my client requests additional financial discovery." Margaret expected the request. "No objection," Rebecca continued. "We also request disclosure regarding Clark Legacy Property Trust." No objection. "Any affiliated business entities?" No objection. "Any investment partnerships?" Margaret looked toward Timothy before answering. No objection. Rebecca paused. That response surprised her. Most people fought discovery requests. Timothy appeared almost relieved. Judge Pierce looked toward Margaret. "Your client understands this process may become extensive." "He does." Judge Pierce turned toward Timothy directly. "Mr. Clark?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Are you willing to cooperate fully?" "Absolutely." Rebecca looked at him carefully. She had represented hundreds of clients during her career. People hiding assets behaved differently. They delayed, objected, argued, requested extensions. Timothy had done none of those things. He welcomed every request. That bothered her, because innocent people often behaved exactly like this. Outside the conference room, Daniel Whitmore checked his phone for the 4th time that morning. He expected Eleanor to text. Nothing arrived. He sent another message. "Everything okay?" No response. 30 minutes passed. Still nothing. Inside the mediation room, Rebecca organized a list of required disclosures. Judge Pierce reviewed each item. Margaret agreed to every deadline: bank statements, tax returns, trust documents, operating agreements, investment records, corporate filings. Everything would be produced. When the meeting finally ended, Rebecca approached Margaret privately. "I owe you an apology." Margaret looked at her. "For what?" "I should have verified title." Margaret smiled politely. "It happens." Rebecca shook her head. "No. Not to me." Margaret understood exactly what Rebecca meant. Successful attorneys built careers by questioning assumptions. This time she hadn't. Rebecca lowered her voice. "How long have you represented Timothy?" "Nearly 16 years. "I had no idea." "Very few people do." Rebecca glanced toward Timothy, who stood near the elevator speaking quietly with Judge Pierce. "He doesn't look like someone who owns a trust," Margaret answered gently. "What does someone who owns a trust look like?" Rebecca smiled despite herself. "Fair point." That afternoon, formal discovery orders were issued. Within 48 hours, accountants began receiving requests: bank records, investment histories, corporate registrations, property ownership, everything connected to Timothy Clark. At the offices of Reeves Financial Forensics in downtown Chicago, senior forensic accountant Michael Reeves accepted the assignment. Michael had spent 23 years tracing hidden assets during divorces, fraud investigations, and commercial litigation. His reputation rested on one principle. Paper rarely lied. People often did. His assistant entered, carrying the first group of files. Everything from the court. Michael glanced through the documents: maintenance supervisor, annual salary, retirement accounts, residential trust. Interesting. He opened another folder: Clark Legacy Property Trust. Then another: Articles of Organization, Clark Residential Holdings, LLC. Another: Fox River Property Management, LLC. Michael stopped turning pages. His assistant noticed. Problem? Not yet? He leaned back. This isn't what I expected. Too complicated? No. He tapped one folder. Too organized. Across the next 2 weeks, Michael's team traced every financial record they could legally obtain: checking accounts, savings, brokerage statements, tax returns, property tax payments, mortgage releases, rental income. Everything matched. Every transfer had supporting documentation. Every deposit corresponded to reported income. Every LLC filed annual reports on time. Every tax return referenced exactly the same ownership structure. Nothing disappeared. Nothing appeared unexpectedly. No unexplained offshore transfers. No hidden shell companies. No suspicious cash withdrawals. Michael had seen hundreds of attempts to conceal wealth. This case felt completely different. Late one evening, he remained alone in his office comparing spreadsheets. His assistant returned carrying another banker box. More records. From where? DuPage County. Michael opened the box. Inside rested renovation permits dating back more than a decade, contractor invoices, material receipts, inspection reports, photographs documenting improvements, everything cataloged. He looked at one invoice. Timothy had personally completed work that would normally require expensive contractors. Labor savings, documented. Another file showed rental income from a duplex purchased years earlier. Every dollar flowed into the trust exactly as reported. Michael quietly laughed to himself. What? His assistant asked. I've spent 2 weeks trying to find something that isn't there. You think he's clean? Michael nodded slowly. I think he's meticulous. The following Monday, Michael called Rebecca Sloan. I've completed the preliminary review. And no evidence of concealed assets. Rebecca remained silent. I'll continue. But so far, he paused. Everything is consistent. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. What about the trust? Properly established. The LLCs? Properly maintained. Any fraudulent transfers? None. Rebecca thanked him before ending the call. She sat motionless for several seconds. The case she believed would become a straightforward property negotiation was becoming something entirely different. Meanwhile, Timothy's daily life barely changed. He continued repairing office buildings, replacing pumps, inspecting boilers, helping tenants. His co-workers knew nothing about forensic accountants or trust documents. Greg Lawson eventually noticed Timothy leaving work early one afternoon. Lawyer again. Timothy smiled. Something like that. Greg hesitated. You okay? I will be. Greg nodded. I've known you a long time. So have I. You've always had a plan. Timothy laughed quietly. Not always. Most of the time. After Greg walked away, Timothy stood beside his truck for a moment before climbing inside. He looked toward the worn leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat. Inside lay copies of every document the accountants had requested. Nothing hidden, nothing altered, nothing missing. He started the engine, unaware that before the week ended, Michael Reeves would discover another set of corporate filings connected to Timothy Documents that would force everyone involved to completely rethink the size of the quiet life they thought they understood. Michael Reeves rarely reacted emotionally to financial records. Numbers were objective. Ownership structures either existed or they did not. Tax filings either matched supporting documentation or they did not. After 23 years as a forensic accountant, he trusted patterns more than intuition. That was why the next discovery caught his attention. It was not because something looked suspicious. It was because everything fit together too perfectly. He sat alone in his office just after 8 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, reviewing a list of entities associated with Clark Legacy Property Trust. His computer displayed annual reports filed with the Illinois Secretary of State. One name appeared repeatedly: Clark Residential Holdings, LLC. Another, Fox River Property Management, LLC. Then a third, Prairie Stone Investments, LLC. Each company listed the same registered office. Each filed annual reports on time. Each paid taxes. Each maintained separate accounting records. None had ever been the subject of a lawsuit. Michael leaned closer to the monitor. Interesting. His assistant, Karen Mills, looked up from the opposite desk. What is it? I don't think these companies were created to hide money. Then why create several? Michael smiled. Risk management? Karen frowned. What do you mean? If one rental property has a lawsuit, it doesn't automatically expose the others. He pointed at the screen. This is textbook asset separation. So it's legal? Very. Karen looked surprised. Most people don't do this. Michael nodded. Most people wait until after they have money. He paused. Timothy Clark built the structure before anyone noticed he had anything worth protecting. That observation changed the entire direction of the investigation. Instead of looking for hidden assets, Michael began reconstructing Timothy's financial history from the beginning. The picture unfolded 1 year at a time. In 2010, Timothy purchased a neglected duplex in Aurora. He spent nearly every evening after work replacing plumbing, repairing drywall, refinishing hardwood floors, and updating electrical fixtures. Instead of hiring contractors, he became the contractor, weekend after weekend, holiday after holiday. While many co-workers spent Saturdays watching football, Timothy hauled lumber, mixed concrete, and painted empty apartments. The first tenants moved in 8 months later. Their rent did not finance vacations. It did not purchase luxury vehicles. Every dollar remained inside the trust. 3 years later, the trust acquired a second property, then a third. The process never changed. Buy carefully, renovate patiently, document everything, reinvest profits, repeat. Michael noticed something unusual. Timothy never borrowed aggressively. Whenever possible, he reduced debt early. He accepted slower growth in exchange for lower risk. Karen studied another spreadsheet. He could have expanded much faster. He could have. So why didn't he? Michael answered without looking away from the documents. Because fast isn't always safe. Across town, Timothy climbed onto the roof of Riverside Plaza to inspect an aging ventilation unit. The October wind carried the smell of approaching rain. Jason Morales, one of the younger technicians, struggled to loosen a rusted bolt. It won't move. Timothy knelt beside him. You're pulling against it. Jason looked confused. What do you mean? Timothy rotated the wrench slightly. Change the angle. Jason tried again. The bolt loosened immediately. He laughed. I've been fighting that thing for 10 minutes. Timothy smiled. Sometimes force isn't the answer. Jason shook his head. You make everything look easy. It wasn't easy the first 100 times. The younger technician laughed, assuming Timothy meant maintenance work. He had no idea the same philosophy governed every financial decision Timothy had ever made. After work, Timothy drove 40 minutes west instead of returning to Geneva. His destination was a modest brick duplex in Aurora. An elderly tenant named Mrs. Evelyn Parker greeted him at the front door. "I'm sorry to bother you." "You never bother me." "The kitchen faucet keeps dripping." Timothy removed his jacket. "I'll take a look." Mrs. Parker had rented from him for nearly 9 years. Her husband had passed away shortly after moving into the apartment. Since then, Timothy had quietly kept her rent below market value. Whenever she apologized for calling him directly instead of a maintenance company, his answer never changed. "You're home." "Taking care of it is part of my job." 20 minutes later, the faucet worked perfectly. Mrs. Parker offered him homemade oatmeal cookies before he left. "You work too hard." Timothy smiled. "I enjoy fixing things." "You always have." As he walked back toward his truck, another tenant waved from across the parking lot. "Thanks for replacing the porch light yesterday." "No problem." Driving away, Timothy reflected on how little anyone connected these moments with wealth. People imagined wealthy landlords sitting behind polished desks, not changing faucets after work, not patching drywall, not mowing grass on Saturday mornings. He preferred it that way. The following Friday, Greg Lawson stopped by Timothy's apartment carrying 2 paper bags. "I brought dinner." "You didn't have to." "My wife insisted." Greg unpacked cheeseburgers from a local diner before sitting at the small kitchen table. For several minutes, they talked about work, broken elevators, upcoming inspections, winter maintenance. Eventually, Greg asked the question he had avoided for weeks. "How are you really doing?" Timothy looked out the window. "I miss the life I thought I was going to have." Greg nodded quietly. "But I don't miss pretending everything was fine." Neither man spoke for several seconds. Greg finally broke the silence. "Can I ask something?" "Sure." "Why'd you stay at Horizon?" Timothy smiled. "I like the work." "Come on." "You've had other offers." "I know." "You could have managed facilities for a Fortune 500 company years ago." Timothy leaned back in his chair. "My father chased titles." Greg waited. He thought bigger always meant better. It didn't. Timothy picked up his coffee. "Horizon gave me predictable hours. Good health insurance. People I trusted. It left evenings and weekends free." "For what?" Timothy looked at him. "Building something that belonged to me." Greg assumed he meant hobbies. He had no idea how literal the statement actually was. Meanwhile, Eleanor sat alone inside the Maple Ridge house. The rooms felt strangely different, not because the furniture had changed, because certainty had disappeared. She walked through the kitchen, where she had hosted dozens of holiday dinners. Past the staircase, Timothy had refinished himself. Into the backyard, where he had spent countless Saturdays rebuilding the deck. For years, she remembered those projects simply as things that somehow got done. Now she began remembering details she had ignored. Timothy leaving before sunrise on weekends, returning covered in drywall dust, spending evenings studying folders after dinner, receiving occasional phone calls he described only as property business. She had never asked another question, not because he refused to answer, because she assumed the answers weren't important. Linda Foster visited that afternoon. "So," Linda placed her purse on the kitchen island. What happens now?" Eleanor stared through the window. "I don't know. I thought the mediation was finished." "It wasn't." Linda hesitated. "The house thing?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "I never even knew." Linda frowned. "Knew what?" Eleanor answered so quietly Linda almost missed it. "I don't actually know how much of Timothy's life I ever understood." Across Chicago, Michael Reeves completed another summary for Rebecca Sloan. The conclusion remained unchanged. No hidden income, no fraudulent transfers, no undisclosed accounts. Instead, every new document strengthened the same conclusion. Timothy Clark had not become financially secure through deception. He had become financially secure through 15 years of relentless consistency. Michael signed the report before placing one final folder on top of the stack. Its cover read, "Property Portfolio Summary." Rebecca would receive it the following morning, and once she opened it, she would discover that the Maple Ridge house had never been Timothy's only significant real estate investment. It had simply been the only one Eleanor had ever lived in. Rebecca Sloan arrived at her office before sunrise. She preferred reviewing important files while the building was still quiet. Phones did not ring. Clients had not yet begun arriving. The silence allowed her to think without interruption. Michael Reeves's forensic report waited on her desk. 38 pages. She expected another routine confirmation that Timothy Clark had complied with discovery. Instead, the executive summary immediately caught her attention. There was no allegation of fraud, no recommendation for additional forensic tracing, no indication of concealed accounts. Instead, Michael had written one sentence that Rebecca read twice. Mr. Clark's financial records demonstrate an unusually consistent pattern of long-term planning and complete documentation. She turned the page. Property 1, Aurora Duplex, purchased in 2010, renovated personally. Property 2, a small 4-unit building in Batavia, purchased 4 years later. Property 3, a mixed-use building in Geneva, ground floor retail, 2 apartments above. Property 4, a warehouse converted into contractor storage units. Every acquisition followed nearly the same pattern. Purchase below market value. Renovation completed over months rather than weeks. Minimal debt, positive cash flow, annual maintenance reserve, everything documented. Rebecca leaned back slowly. The annual salary Timothy earned as a maintenance supervisor suddenly made sense. It had never been intended to make him wealthy. It had provided stability while his investments quietly matured. She looked at the final page. Estimated value of trust-controlled real estate. The number was considerably higher than she had expected. Not extraordinary by the standards of large commercial developers, but remarkable for someone everyone believed lived paycheck to paycheck. Rebecca closed the report. She understood something she wished she had realized weeks earlier. She had evaluated Timothy through Eleanor's description instead of through evidence. That mistake would not happen again. Later that morning, Eleanor arrived. She looked tired. Not physically, mentally. Sleep had become difficult since mediation. Rebecca handed her the report. "I think you should read this." Eleanor spent several minutes turning pages without speaking. She stopped at the property list. "There are more," Rebecca nodded. "There have been for years. I've never heard of any of these." "I believe that." Eleanor continued reading. Each address, each purchase date, each renovation timeline, every page forced another memory to the surface. Weekend trips Timothy described only as checking on a building, evenings spent replacing flooring, holiday mornings leaving early because a tenant had a plumbing problem. She had never questioned him, not because he had hidden anything, because she had assumed those errands were insignificant. Now each memory fit together differently, like scattered puzzle pieces suddenly forming a complete picture. She closed the report. "Why didn't he tell me?" Rebecca answered honestly. "I don't know." Across town, Timothy spent the morning replacing damaged ceiling panels inside a medical office building. One of the nurses approached while he worked. "Mr. Clark?" "Yes." "Thank you for fixing the leak so quickly." He smiled. "It needed to be done. My patients appreciate it. So do I." Simple conversations like that remained his favorite part of the job. No titles, no presentations, no politics, just solving problems. His supervisor, Frank Delaney, found him a few minutes later. "Got a minute?" "Sure." Frank handed him an envelope. "Corporate sent this." Inside was another promotion offer. Regional Facilities Director. Larger territory. Nearly double the salary. Timothy read it quietly. Frank grinned. You've earned it. Timothy folded the letter carefully. I appreciate that. You gonna accept? Timothy looked around the building. Maintenance carts, technicians laughing in the hallway. The familiar smell of fresh paint and sawdust. I don't think so, Frank stared. You serious? I am. You'd make a fortune. Timothy smiled. I'm already doing work I enjoy. Frank laughed. I swear, Clark, I've never figured you out. Timothy only shrugged. You don't have to. That afternoon, Daniel Whitmore requested lunch with Eleanor at an upscale restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. He arrived 10 minutes late. Apologized. Checked his phone twice before sitting down. Eleanor noticed. You seem distracted. Busy week. He ordered without looking at the menu. After the waiter left, Eleanor placed Michael's report on the table. Daniel glanced at it. What's that? Timothy. Daniel barely looked interested. I thought everything was settled. It isn't. She slid the report toward him. He owns investment properties. Daniel skimmed one page before pushing it back. So, everyone thought he had nothing. Daniel leaned back. Eleanor. What? It doesn't change anything. She searched his face. Doesn't it? Daniel hesitated. I mean, the divorce is still happening. She noticed something subtle. His confidence sounded forced. For months, Daniel had spoken as though Timothy would simply disappear once the marriage ended. Now he seemed eager to change the subject. Let's not spend lunch talking about your ex-husband. The word ex-husband sounded strangely premature. The divorce was not final. The legal process had only become more complicated. Conversation drifted awkwardly after that. Work, upcoming conferences, corporate restructuring. Nothing felt natural. When lunch ended, Daniel hugged Eleanor briefly before walking toward his office. Halfway across the plaza, he answered a phone call. His tone changed immediately. Professional. Careful. He never looked back. Eleanor remained standing outside the restaurant longer than she intended. For the first time, she wondered whether Daniel had been attracted to certainty more than to her. Certainty that the divorce would be quick. Certainty that her future would remain uncomplicated. That certainty no longer existed. Meanwhile, gossip quietly spread through Lakeshore health systems. Nobody knew details, only fragments. Eleanor's divorce hit a snag. Something about property. Lawyers are involved. Corporate offices had a way of magnifying rumors. Linda Foster noticed people lowering their voices whenever Eleanor entered the break room. The whispers irritated her. She confronted one coworker directly. What exactly are people saying? The woman looked uncomfortable. Nothing. Come on. I heard, she hesitated, that her husband's finances weren't what everyone thought. Linda dismissed it immediately. That's impossible. The coworker simply shrugged. I don't know. But people are talking. By the end of the week, Eleanor found herself excluded from 2 informal executive dinners she normally attended. Officially, scheduling conflicts were blamed. Unofficially, senior leadership disliked public controversy. Daniel became noticeably less available. Meetings were postponed, phone calls became shorter, text messages arrived hours later instead of immediately. Nothing dramatic, just enough to notice. Late Friday afternoon, Eleanor called him. He answered after several rings. Hey, are you free tonight? A pause. I can't. You've been saying that a lot. I've got board preparation. You said that yesterday. Another pause. Eleanor. His voice softened. I think we both need some space until everything settles down. The sentence landed harder than she expected. So that's it. I didn't say that, But you meant it. Daniel didn't answer. Silence became the answer instead. When the call ended, Eleanor sat alone in her office, staring at the city skyline. For months, she believed she was leaving behind an ordinary man for an extraordinary future. Now that future seemed strangely fragile. Across the Fox River in Geneva, Timothy finished replacing a porch light at one of his rental properties. Mrs. Evelyn Parker waved from her window. "Everything fixed. Good as new." She smiled warmly. "You always keep your promises." Timothy waved before climbing into his pickup. His phone buzzed. Margaret Donovan. "Good afternoon. I've received another letter from Rebecca." "What does she want?" "Settlement discussions." "So soon?" Margaret smiled on the other end of the line. "Her position is changing." Timothy started the engine. "What changed?" "I believe." She paused. "They've finally stopped underestimating you." Timothy looked through the windshield at the quiet street before pulling away. He had never wanted anyone to fear him. Respect had always been enough. And for the first time since Eleanor announced the divorce, respect was beginning to replace assumption. The deposition was scheduled for the first Monday in November. Unlike mediation, there would be no attempt to negotiate, no discussion about compromise, only questions, only sworn answers. Rebecca Sloan arrived carrying 4 thick binders prepared over the previous 2 weeks. Every financial statement, trust amendment, bank record, and property schedule had been indexed with colored tabs. She intended to leave nothing unexplored. Timothy entered the conference room exactly 5 minutes before 9. He wore the same charcoal suit he had worn during mediation, the same polished black shoes, the same stainless steel watch he had owned for nearly 15 years. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Nothing suggested someone who controlled multiple investment properties. Judge Samuel Pierce was not present. Instead, a certified court reporter sat at one end of the table, arranging recording equipment, while another clerk organized exhibits. Rebecca glanced toward Timothy. "Good morning." "Good morning." "You understand you're under oath today?" "I do." Margaret Donovan sat beside Timothy without opening a single folder. She already knew every answer he would give. The court reporter raised her hand. "Please state your full name for the record." "Timothy James Clark," Rebecca began gently. "Mr. Clark, what is your current occupation?" "I'm a maintenance supervisor for Horizon Commercial Property Management." "How long have you held that position?" "Almost 19 years. "Annual salary," Timothy answered without hesitation. Rebecca wrote the number beside her notes. "Do you own Clark Legacy Property Trust?" "No." Rebecca looked up. "You don't?" "I serve as trustee." "Who owns the trust assets?" "The trust itself." Rebecca nodded slowly. She had expected that answer after reviewing Margaret's documents. Still, hearing Timothy explain it clearly helped establish the record. "What is the purpose of the trust?" "Long-term asset management." "When was it established?" "Several years before my marriage." "Why?" Timothy paused, only briefly. "My father lost nearly everything because he relied on verbal agreements instead of legal structure. I decided I wouldn't repeat that mistake." Rebecca studied him carefully. His voice carried no bitterness, only fact. She moved to the next section. "Did you ever attempt to hide the trust from Eleanor?" "No." "Did she know it existed?" "Yes." "Did she know every detail?" "I don't know." "Did she ever ask?" "No." Rebecca looked through another binder. "So you never refused to answer questions about your finances?" "No." "You never denied owning investment properties?" "No." "You simply weren't asked?" "Correct." Margaret remained silent. The answers required no clarification. Everything matched the documents already produced. Rebecca changed direction. "Let's discuss Maple Ridge Drive." She placed a photograph of the house on the table. When was this property purchased? October 2014. Who signed the purchase documents? I did. In what capacity? As trustee for Clark Legacy Property Trust. Were those documents recorded? Yes. Publicly? Yes. Rebecca nodded again. So anyone could have obtained them? Yes. The simplicity of the answer echoed through the room. Margaret quietly made one note on her yellow legal pad. Public record, Rebecca continued. After purchasing the residence, did you and Eleanor move into the home? Yes. Did Eleanor contribute financially to household expenses? Yes. Utilities? Yes. Home improvements? Yes. Rebecca looked towards the court reporter. So, to be clear, she financially contributed to maintaining the residence? Yes. But not to acquiring legal title, Timothy answered calmly. No. Across the room, Eleanor watched silently. Hearing the distinction spoken aloud felt strangely unsettling. For years, she had believed maintaining a home and owning it naturally became the same thing. The law viewed them differently. Rebecca turned another page. Mr. Clark, did you ever intentionally encourage your wife to believe she owned the house jointly? No. Did you ever tell her she owned it? No. Did you ever tell her she didn't? Timothy considered the question. No. Rebecca leaned forward. Why not? He looked directly at her. Because she never asked. Silence settled briefly across the conference room. Even Rebecca stopped writing. It was such an ordinary answer, and yet it explained years of misunderstanding. Margaret looked toward Timothy with quiet approval. Truth required very little decoration. Rebecca resumed. Let's discuss your investment companies. She held up another exhibit. Clark Residential Holdings, LLC. What is its purpose? It owns residential rental properties. Fox River Property Management, Prairie Stone Investments, commercial real estate. Rebecca turned another page. How involved are you in day-to-day operations? I manage them. Personally? Yes. While working full-time? Yes. How? Timothy smiled faintly. I don't watch much television. A few people around the table smiled despite themselves. Even the court reporter looked up briefly before returning to her keyboard. Rebecca continued. How many hours per week would you estimate you spend maintaining these properties? It depends. Average? 20 to 25. After your regular job? Mostly. Weekends? Often. She paused. So for nearly 15 years. You worked 2 jobs. Timothy nodded. I suppose that's one way to describe it. Rebecca closed one binder and opened another. This section concerned income, rental receipts, operating expenses, depreciation schedules. Every figure matched the tax returns. Every tax return matched the bank deposits. Every deposit matched lease agreements. Michael Reeves had been right. Nothing failed to reconcile. Rebecca looked toward Margaret. I have no objection to authenticity. Margaret nodded. Thank you. That single statement carried more significance than most people in the room realized. It meant Rebecca no longer questioned the legitimacy of Timothy's records, only their legal implications. The deposition continued into the afternoon. Questions about renovations, insurance, trust administration, maintenance reserves, capital improvements. Each answer remained short, specific, supported by documents. Near the end of the session, Rebecca reached one final subject. Mr. Clark, she lifted a folder labeled Employment. You've declined 3 promotions during the past 11 years. Yes. Each would have significantly increased your salary. Yes. Why decline them? Timothy looked toward the window. Chicago's skyline reflected against the gray waters of the river below. My maintenance job gave me something more valuable. Rebecca waited. Predictable time. I already had enough money. I needed more freedom. The sentence lingered. Rebecca slowly closed the folder. She understood. Not completely, but enough. Many people spent entire careers chasing higher salaries. Timothy had quietly spent his building independence instead. As everyone prepared to leave, Margaret organized the exhibits while Rebecca remained seated. One financial statement still rested in front of her. It summarized the trust's operating history over the previous decade. Consistent revenue, growing equity, minimal debt. Nothing extraordinary in any single year. Remarkable only when viewed together. She looked toward Timothy before he reached the door. "Mr. Clark." He turned. "Yes. I have one question." He waited. Rebecca smiled politely. "Not as opposing counsel. As a person." Timothy nodded. "Go ahead." She glanced once more at the financial statement before looking back at him. "With everything you've built, why did you keep letting people believe you were just a maintenance supervisor?" Timothy thought for several seconds. Then he answered quietly. "Because the people who respected me before they knew were the only ones whose opinion I ever trusted afterward." Rebecca watched him leave without another word. The conference room became silent once again. She lowered her eyes to the financial statement still lying on the table. For weeks she had searched those pages looking for deception. Instead, she had found something far rarer: consistency, discipline, and a man whose greatest advantage had never been money. It had been that almost everyone underestimated him. By the time the deposition transcripts were completed, the tone of the case had changed completely. It was no longer a dispute about hidden assets. It had become a lesson in documented ownership. Rebecca Sloan spent the next several days reviewing every answer Timothy had given under oath. She searched for inconsistencies, dates that did not align, statements unsupported by evidence, contradictions between testimony and financial records. She found none. Each answer pointed to another document. Each document pointed to another public filing. Every filing had existed years before Eleanor filed for divorce. Nothing had been created after the separation. Nothing had been altered. Nothing suggested an attempt to manipulate the divorce process. Late Thursday afternoon, Rebecca placed the deposition transcript beside Michael Reeves's forensic report. Together, they told the same story from two different directions. One through testimony, the other through numbers. Neither left much room for argument. She picked up the phone. "Michael, good afternoon. I've reviewed everything. And you were right." A brief silence followed. Michael finally asked, "About what?" "This was never a concealment case." "No, it was an assumption case." Michael smiled. "I've been waiting for someone else to say that." Rebecca looked through her office window toward the busy streets below. "I should have realized it sooner." "You weren't the only one." After ending the call, she scheduled another meeting with Eleanor. This conversation would be different from every previous one. Not because the law had changed, because the facts had finally become impossible to ignore. The following morning, Eleanor arrived carrying a notebook she never opened. She immediately noticed Rebecca's expression. "What happened?" Rebecca motioned toward the chair. "Sit down." Eleanor did. Rebecca placed 3 folders on the conference table. One contained the forensic accounting report. The second contained the deposition transcript. The third contained certified property records. She tapped the stack gently. "I've reached a conclusion." Eleanor waited. "We need to change our strategy." "Why?" Rebecca answered without hesitation. "Because we cannot successfully argue that Timothy concealed separate property." Eleanor looked stunned. "What about the trust?" "It's legitimate. The companies, properly maintained. The properties, legally documented." Rebecca paused. "I've looked for another explanation. I haven't found one. Eleanor stared at the papers without touching them. So, the house was never ours. Rebecca chose her words carefully. It was your home. But legally, it belonged to the trust. Eleanor lowered her eyes. Memories returned one after another, painting the nursery they never used after deciding not to have children, hosting Thanksgiving dinners, watching the first snowfall from the living room window, planting roses beside the front porch. She had loved that house. She simply had not understood its legal history. Tears threatened to form, but she held them back. I feel foolish. Rebecca shook her head. No. You believed something because it felt true. Unfortunately, courts don't decide ownership based on feelings. Across town, Timothy spent Friday morning helping replace a damaged electrical panel at a manufacturing facility. A young apprentice accidentally dropped an expensive testing meter. I'm sorry. Timothy picked it up. It happens. I'll pay for it. Timothy inspected the casing. No need. It still works. The apprentice looked relieved. You never yell. Timothy smiled. Yelling rarely fixes anything. Frank Delaney overheard the conversation. As they walked toward another building, he glanced at Timothy. You're taking another personal day next week. I have mediation. Frank nodded. Everything getting closer. I think so. Frank hesitated. My wife asked me something. What? She wondered why you never told anybody about your investments. Timothy laughed quietly. Apparently people are talking. A little. Frank looked genuinely curious. You could have impressed a lot of people? Timothy opened the maintenance truck. I wasn't trying to impress people. Frank folded his arms. Then why build all of it? Timothy paused before answering. So nobody could ever decide my future for me. Frank considered that sentence long after Timothy walked away. It was not about money. It was about independence. Meanwhile, Margaret Donovan received another letter from Rebecca Sloan. Unlike previous correspondence, this one contained no demands, only a request. Settlement conference requested. Margaret smiled. She called Timothy that evening. They're ready? For mediation? For resolution? Timothy looked around his apartment. Moving boxes still remained stacked against one wall. He had never fully unpacked. Do you think Eleanor understands now? Margaret answered honestly. I think she's beginning to. I never wanted to embarrass her. I know. You've said that from the beginning? Timothy leaned back in his chair. People keep acting like I planned all this. You didn't. No. I planned for uncertainty. Not divorce. Margaret nodded slowly. There's an important difference. Saturday afternoon brought the first snow of the season. Only a light dusting covered the sidewalks in Geneva. Timothy spent the morning replacing smoke detector batteries in one of his apartment buildings before stopping at a local hardware store. The cashier recognized him immediately. Back again. Need more paint. You own the old brick apartments, right? I help take care of them. The cashier smiled. They're always in good shape. Thank you. As Timothy carried supplies toward his truck, Greg Lawson called. You busy? A little. Coffee? Sure. They met at a small diner overlooking the Fox River. Greg stirred cream into his coffee before speaking. My wife told me something. Timothy laughed. Everyone seems to be telling everyone something lately. Greg smiled. She heard you've got lawyers' trusts buildings. Timothy nodded. I do. Greg leaned forward. You really own all that? Timothy shook his head. The trust owns it. Greg laughed. See, that's exactly why nobody understands you. Timothy smiled. I guess not. Greg became serious. Can I ask one thing? Go ahead. Why didn't you ever tell me? Timothy looked out the window. I knew you'd treat me the same either way. I would. Exactly. Greg smiled warmly. You know, that's probably the nicest compliment you've ever given me. Both men laughed. It was the first genuine laugh Timothy had enjoyed in months. On Monday morning, Rebecca Sloan formally recommended settlement to Eleanor. Not because they lacked arguments, because continuing litigation would almost certainly produce the same conclusion with greater expense. Eleanor signed the mediation request quietly. As Rebecca organized the paperwork, she looked across the table. There's something else. What? I've practiced family law for 21 years. Eleanor listened. I've represented wealthy clients. Powerful clients. Famous clients? She closed the file. I've rarely represented someone who misunderstood her own marriage as completely as you did. The words were not cruel, only honest. Eleanor lowered her eyes. I misunderstood Timothy. Rebecca nodded gently. I think you misunderstood what kind of man he was. That evening, Timothy received a message from Margaret. Mediation confirmed, Wednesday, 9 o'clock. One final attempt to resolve everything. He read the message once before placing the phone back into his pocket. For months he had prepared documents, answered questions, produced records. Never once had he raised his voice. Now the facts stood on their own. The only thing left to determine was whether those facts would end the marriage with dignity or force one final legal battle that neither side truly wanted anymore. Wednesday morning arrived under a clear November sky. Unlike their first mediation session, neither Timothy nor Eleanor walked into the conference room, believing they already knew the outcome. The assumptions were gone. Only facts remained. Timothy parked in the same public garage he had used before. He carried the same worn leather portfolio. Inside were copies of documents he hoped he would never need to open again. Margaret Donovan met him in the lobby. You look calmer. I am. You surprised? A little. She smiled. The truth usually has that effect. When they entered the conference room, Rebecca Sloan was already speaking quietly with Eleanor. Neither woman appeared defensive. Neither appeared confrontational. The atmosphere felt remarkably different from only a few weeks earlier. Judge Samuel Pierce entered precisely at 9. He looked around the table before taking his seat. I've reviewed the deposition transcript. He folded his hands. And I've reviewed the updated financial reports. His eyes moved from Rebecca to Margaret. It appears both parties now have a substantially clearer understanding of the facts. Rebecca nodded first. Yes, Your Honor. Margaret followed. We agree. Judge Pierce looked toward Eleanor. Mrs. Clark. She answered quietly. Yes. Then toward Timothy. Mr. Clark. Yes. The judge opened a yellow legal pad. My responsibility today is not to determine who was the better spouse. No court can do that. My responsibility is to determine whether both parties can reach a fair legal resolution. He paused. I encourage professionalism. I discourage revenge. Timothy looked toward the judge. You won't have to discourage me. Judge Pierce nodded with quiet approval. Rebecca began. Following our review of the evidence, she glanced briefly toward Eleanor. My client acknowledges that the Maple Ridge residence is legally owned by Clark Legacy Property Trust. Hearing those words, spoken formally, carried unexpected weight. Weeks earlier, Eleanor would have challenged the statement immediately. Now she simply lowered her eyes. Rebecca continued. My client is no longer requesting division of that property. Margaret made no attempt to celebrate. She merely wrote a short note. Issue resolved. Judge Pierce looked toward Timothy. Mr. Clark, your response. Timothy spoke calmly. I appreciate the acknowledgement. Nothing more. The judge noticed. No additional comment. Timothy shook his head. No, Your Honor. Judge Pierce smiled faintly. Very well. Rebecca turned another page. There remain questions regarding retirement accounts and marital savings. Margaret nodded. We've reviewed those. She slid a revised settlement proposal across the table. Rebecca read silently for several minutes. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. She looked toward Timothy. This is... She searched for the right word. Generous. Eleanor looked up immediately. What is it? Rebecca handed her the proposal. Eleanor began reading. The document surprised her. Timothy proposed that Eleanor keep every dollar in her executive retirement account. He waived any claim to several investment funds accumulated during the marriage. He agreed she should retain her company stock options. Even more unexpectedly, he offered to pay for 6 additional months of health insurance coverage through the existing policy until her employer's revised plan became effective. Eleanor looked across the table. You don't have to do this, Timothy answered honestly. I know. Then why? He thought for a moment. Because ending a marriage fairly matters more to me than winning one. Silence settled over the room. Judge Pierce watched both parties carefully. During decades on the bench, he had witnessed countless divorces fueled by resentment. People fought over dishes, furniture, photographs, even old holiday decorations. Timothy was voluntarily giving away assets he had every legal right to contest. Not because he had to, because he chose to. Rebecca lowered the proposal. I've reviewed the numbers. She looked toward Eleanor. I recommend accepting. Eleanor continued reading. Every page reflected balance rather than punishment. There were no hidden traps, no humiliating conditions, no attempt to exploit her earlier misunderstanding. The settlement simply divided marital assets while respecting legally separate property. Finally, she spoke. I accept. Margaret nodded once. So noted. Judge Pierce looked relieved. Excellent. The remaining paperwork required another hour. Bank accounts, household furniture, vehicles, personal property, everything moved efficiently. There were occasional questions. Minor clarifications. Small revisions to wording. Nothing more. Shortly before noon, Judge Pierce placed the final settlement in front of both parties. I'll ask one final time. Has anyone signed under pressure? No, Timothy answered. No, Eleanor echoed. Has anyone withheld information? No. No. Does anyone wish to reconsider? Neither spoke. Judge Pierce slid the signature pages forward. Timothy signed first. His handwriting remained steady. Then Eleanor. The scratching of 2 pens across paper marked the official end of 18 years of marriage. Judge Pierce signed last. He removed his glasses before looking toward both of them. I know today isn't easy. No divorce ever truly is. He paused. But I want the record to reflect something. He looked directly at Timothy. Mr. Clark. I've rarely seen a party cooperate with discovery as completely as you have. Then toward Eleanor. Mrs. Clark, you ultimately acknowledged documentary evidence even when it was personally difficult. He nodded toward both attorneys. Professional conduct from counsel made resolution possible. Margaret thanked him quietly. Rebecca did the same. The judge closed the file. The marriage is officially dissolved. No one celebrated. There was nothing to celebrate, only acceptance. As everyone gathered their belongings, Eleanor remained seated. Timothy noticed. He waited. When the others stepped into the hallway, she finally spoke. I owe you an apology. He stopped beside the door. You don't owe me anything today. I do. Her voice trembled slightly. I spent years believing I understood you. She looked down at her hands. I didn't. Timothy remained silent. She continued. I thought you avoided ambition. I thought you were satisfied with less. Another pause. I never realized. She struggled to finish. You were building the future while I was measuring success by promotions. Timothy answered gently. We were measuring different things. She nodded slowly. I know that now. For several seconds, neither moved. Finally, Eleanor asked the question that had quietly followed her since mediation. Were you ever going to tell me everything? Timothy looked toward the conference room window overlooking the Chicago River. I thought there would be time. Those 6 words carried no accusation, only regret. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. So did I. Timothy offered a small, respectful nod before leaving the room. He did not look back. In the hallway, Greg Lawson was waiting near the elevators. He had driven into the city simply to give his friend a ride, if needed. When Timothy appeared, Greg studied his face. How'd it go? It's over. Greg smiled. How do you feel? Timothy considered the question. Lighter. They walked toward the elevators together. Outside, cold wind swept between the downtown buildings. Timothy loosened his tie before taking a long breath. For the first time in months, there were no court dates on his calendar, no depositions, no financial disclosures, no attorneys requesting documents. Only ordinary life waiting to begin again. Across the street, Eleanor stood alone beside her car. She watched Timothy climb into his aging pickup truck, the same truck she had quietly wished he would replace years earlier. As the engine started, she suddenly understood something that had never occurred to her during their marriage. The truck had never reflected what Timothy could afford. It reflected what he valued. He drove away exactly as he had lived, without unnecessary attention, without proving anything, and with every mile that separated them, Eleanor realized the quiet man she once underestimated had never been trying to look successful. He had been too busy becoming secure. Winter settled gently across northern Illinois. The divorce faded from courthouse calendars, then from newspaper records, and eventually from everyday conversation. Life, as it always did, moved forward. For Timothy Clark, moving forward did not mean starting over from nothing. It meant returning to the quiet rhythm he had built long before the marriage ended. He remained in the furnished apartment through Christmas, not because he had nowhere else to go, because he refused to make another major decision while emotion still lingered. Margaret Donovan had once given him a piece of advice he never forgot. Never make permanent decisions during temporary pain. He followed it. Every evening after work, he visited one of his properties. Sometimes he replaced a furnace filter. Sometimes he met with electricians. Sometimes he simply walked through vacant units, making notes about future improvements. The work steadied him. It always had. By early spring, Timothy found a house that immediately felt different. It stood on a quiet, tree-lined street in Geneva, Illinois, only a few blocks from the Fox River. Unlike the Maple Ridge house, this one carried history instead of grandeur. Built in the late 1920s, the 2-story brick home featured wide oak floors, original wood-trimmed tall windows, and a deep front porch with a porch swing that had weathered decades of Illinois winters. Most buyers overlooked it. The kitchen needed updating. The detached garage required structural repairs. The landscaping had been neglected for years. Timothy smiled the moment he stepped inside. He wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for peace. Thomas Anderson, the same commercial broker who had helped him years earlier, met him at the property. "You've got that look again." Timothy laughed. "What look?" "The one you had when you first walked through Maple Ridge." Timothy slowly examined the original staircase. "This place has good bones." Thomas nodded. "I knew you'd say that." The purchase closed 6 weeks later. Unlike his previous acquisitions, this house would belong to Timothy personally. Not because Margaret advised it, because he wanted one place that existed outside business decisions, one place that simply felt like home. He spent nearly every Saturday restoring it. Instead of hiring contractors, he worked room by room. He refinished hardwood floors, repaired antique window frames, installed modern insulation behind original walls. Neighbors occasionally stopped to introduce themselves. Most assumed he had recently retired from construction. Timothy never corrected them. One afternoon, an older neighbor named Richard Holloway wandered over carrying 2 bottles of cold lemonade. "Looks like you've been busy." Timothy accepted one gratefully. "I enjoy projects." Richard looked around. "You doing all this yourself?" "Most of it." Richard laughed. "They don't make many people like that anymore." Timothy smiled. "My father used to say, if you can fix something, you should at least try." Within a few months, the house slowly transformed, not into a luxury home, into a comfortable one. The front porch swing was repaired. Native flowers replaced overgrown shrubs. Books filled the living room shelves. A small workshop occupied half the garage. For the first time in years, Timothy found himself looking forward to going home. Meanwhile, business continued growing quietly. Clark Residential Holdings acquired another duplex outside St. Charles. Fox River Property Management hired its first full-time maintenance coordinator. Instead of expanding aggressively, Timothy focused on improving the properties he already owned. Clean apartments, safe neighborhoods, reliable repairs. Tenant satisfaction remained more important than rapid profits. Mrs. Evelyn Parker often joked with new tenants. "You'll never find a landlord who answers his own phone." Timothy simply smiled whenever he heard her say it. One Friday afternoon, Greg Lawson stopped by the Geneva house carrying a toolbox. "I figured you could use another pair of hands." "I never turn down free help." The 2 men spent the afternoon rebuilding the garage doors. During a break, they sat on overturned buckets, drinking iced tea. Greg looked around the property. "So this is home now?" "I think so." "It's quieter." Timothy nodded. "I like quiet." Greg laughed. "That may be the biggest understatement I've ever heard." After a few minutes, Greg became serious. "You know, people at work finally figured out you own investment properties." Timothy looked amused. "I wondered when that would happen." "You know what surprised everybody?" "What?" "Nothing changed." Timothy smiled. "What do you mean?" "You still show up first. You still crawl into mechanical rooms. You still eat lunch with everybody." Greg shook his head. "Most people would have quit by now." Timothy looked toward the river visible beyond the trees. "I never worked because I had to. I worked because I liked solving problems." That answer spread through Horizon Commercial Property Management faster than any rumor about Timothy's wealth. Within weeks, younger technicians began asking him different questions. Not about divorce, not about court, about money. One apprentice named Jason Morales stayed after work one evening. "Mr. Clark." "Yes." "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "I've been saving a little every month. I don't know what to do with it." Timothy leaned against the workbench. "How old are you?" 24? When I was 24, I thought saving $100 was impossible." Jason laughed. "It still feels impossible." Timothy nodded. "Start anyway." Jason waited. "That's it?" "That's the advice." Timothy smiled. "Consistency changes your life. Not excitement." Jason considered those words. "So you didn't get lucky?" Timothy shook his head. "No. I just repeated small decisions for a very long time." Over the following months, more employees sought Timothy's advice. How to budget, how to avoid unnecessary debt, how to buy a first property. Eventually, Horizon's owner invited Timothy to host an optional financial literacy workshop after work. Timothy almost declined. Public speaking had never interested him. Frank Delaney convinced him otherwise. "You've taught maintenance for years." This is just another skill. The first workshop attracted 12 employees. Timothy arrived carrying only a legal pad, no presentation, no expensive charts. He simply told stories about his father's failed business, about documenting every expense, about buying the first duplex, about patience. When someone asked how long it took before he felt successful, Timothy answered honestly, "I still don't think about success. I think about freedom." The room became unusually quiet. After the meeting ended, Jason approached him. "I always thought rich people started rich." Timothy smiled. "Some do. But discipline doesn't care where you start." That evening, after everyone left, Timothy locked the training room and walked toward the parking lot. Inside his truck sat an envelope forwarded from his old address. The handwriting on the front looked familiar, elegant, carefully printed, no return address. He recognized it immediately. Eleanor. Timothy rested one hand on the steering wheel before opening the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. He unfolded the page slowly. The first sentence made him stop reading. Not because it was dramatic, because it was the first completely honest thing Eleanor had written to him in a very long time. Timothy sat inside his truck for several minutes before reading the rest of the letter. Outside, the parking lot had nearly emptied. The last maintenance crew had already driven away. Evening sunlight reflected across the windshield, turning the paper in his hands a warm shade of gold. He began reading again. "Dear Timothy, this isn't a letter asking you to come back. It isn't an apology because I expect forgiveness. It's simply the truth I should have admitted much sooner." He continued slowly. "I spent years believing I understood success because I could measure promotions, salaries, and recognition. I never realized I had stopped measuring character. By the time I noticed the difference, I had already damaged something I couldn't repair." There were no excuses, no mention of Daniel Whitmore, no attempt to rewrite the past. Only quiet honesty. The final paragraph was short. "If you're willing, I'd like to thank you properly for the fairness you showed me. One conversation, nothing more. If not, I'll understand." Below the signature was the name of a small cafe overlooking the Fox River. Saturday, 2:00. Timothy folded the letter carefully. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he drove home. The envelope remained on the passenger seat during the entire drive. That evening, he placed the letter beside a reading lamp in his living room. He looked at it several times, never opening it again. The next morning, he called Margaret Donovan. "I received something." "A legal document?" "No, a letter." Margaret smiled through the phone. "I suspected that might happen." "What should I do?" She laughed softly. "I think you're asking the wrong person." "Probably. I can't tell you whether to meet her." She paused. "But I can ask a question." Timothy waited. "What outcome are you hoping for?" He thought quietly. "Peace." "Then don't attend looking for answers. Attend only if you're already at peace without them." The advice stayed with him all week. Saturday arrived bright and unusually warm for early spring. The cafe sat beside the Fox River, where cyclists passed along the riverwalk and families strolled beneath budding maple trees. Timothy arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. He ordered black coffee and chose a table outside. At exactly 2:00, Eleanor appeared. She wore a simple light blue sweater, dark jeans, and walking shoes. There were no designer handbags, no corporate attire, no carefully constructed executive image. She looked different. Not because of her clothes, because she looked tired in a way promotions could never explain. She approached slowly. "Thank you for coming." Timothy stood. "It's good to see you." They sat. For several moments, neither spoke. The waitress delivered coffee before quietly walking away. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "I almost didn't send the letter." Timothy smiled faintly. "I almost didn't come." She nodded. Fair enough. The conversation began cautiously. Work, the weather, Greg, Margaret, safe topics. Eventually, Eleanor looked toward the river. I resigned. Timothy looked surprised. From Lakeshore? Last month. I thought you enjoyed it. I used to. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Everything felt different afterward. The promotions. The meetings. The travel. She shook her head gently. I realized I spent years climbing a ladder without ever asking whether it leaned against the right wall. Timothy listened quietly. He offered no judgment, no advice, no satisfaction. Eleanor noticed. You still don't say much. He smiled. You always said you talked enough for both of us. For the first time that afternoon, she laughed. A genuine laugh. I remember. The silence that followed felt comfortable rather than awkward. People passed along the river walk. A dog chased ducks near the shoreline. Somewhere nearby, a church bell marked the half hour. Eleanor finally looked directly at him. Can I ask you something? Of course. When did you realize we were drifting apart? Timothy answered honestly. I don't know the exact day. But I remember the first time you apologized to someone because of my work boots. She lowered her eyes. I remember that, too. I should never have done it. He shrugged gently. It wasn't about the boots. It was about what they represented. She nodded slowly. I was embarrassed by the wrong things. Neither mentioned Daniel. There was no need. Some chapters had already ended. After another long pause, Eleanor asked the question she had carried since the divorce. Did you ever hate me? Timothy looked across the water before answering. No. She seemed surprised. I was hurt. I was disappointed. But hate would have kept me tied to the past. He smiled softly. I wanted to move forward. A tear escaped before Eleanor could stop it. I'm sorry. I know. I truly am. I know. She laughed quietly through the tears. You always make forgiveness sound so simple. Timothy shook his head. It isn't. It's a decision. Another silence settled between them. This one lasted longer. Finally, Eleanor reached into her purse and removed a small key. She placed it on the table. Timothy recognized it immediately. The spare key to the old mailbox at Maple Ridge. I found it while cleaning. I thought you should have it. He picked it up. For a moment, memories returned. Snowfall on the front porch. Summer evenings grilling in the backyard. Christmas lights hanging from the gutters. A life that had once been real. Then he slipped the key into his pocket. Thank you. Eleanor looked relieved. I think, she hesitated, that's everything I wanted to say. Timothy nodded. I think so too. They stood together. Neither reached for a hug immediately. Then Eleanor stepped forward. He returned the brief embrace. Nothing romantic remained, only gratitude. When they stepped apart, Eleanor smiled. I hope you're happy. Timothy answered without hesitation. I am. And you? She looked towards the river. I'm learning. He believed her. They walked together to the parking lot before stopping where the sidewalk divided. One path led toward Eleanor's car, the other toward Timothy's truck. Years earlier, they would have walked the same direction. Today, they did not. Eleanor raised one hand. Goodbye, Timothy. He smiled. Take care, Eleanor. She walked away without looking back. Timothy watched until she disappeared beyond the trees. Then he turned toward his pickup. The afternoon sun filtered through fresh spring leaves, casting moving shadows across the pavement. For the first time since signing the divorce papers, there was nothing left unsaid. Only two separate lives, two different futures, and a quiet understanding that respect once lost could never rebuild a marriage. but it could still allow 2 people to leave it with dignity. 1 year later, Timothy Clark's mornings still began before sunrise. Some habits never changed. He still brewed black coffee in the same small kitchen. He still drove an aging pickup truck that now had more than 220,000 miles on the odometer. He still arrived at Horizon Commercial Property Management before anyone else. The younger technicians no longer underestimated him, not because they knew the size of his real estate portfolio, because they had watched him spend another year treating every employee with the same quiet respect. Jason Morales had purchased his first duplex. Greg Lawson finally opened the retirement account he had postponed for years. 2 other technicians had started small investment funds after attending Timothy's informal workshops. Whenever they thanked him, Timothy answered with the same sentence. "I only shared what someone once taught me." His own business continued growing carefully, not rapidly, not dramatically. Another apartment building had been renovated. Vacancies remained low. Maintenance requests were handled quickly. Tenants stayed longer because they trusted that repairs would actually be completed. That trust meant more to Timothy than impressive financial statements. One Saturday afternoon, he walked through the restored house in Geneva. The hardwood floors reflected soft afternoon light. Books lined the shelves in the living room. Fresh flowers rested on the dining table. The front porch swing moved gently in the breeze. It was not the largest house he had ever lived in. It was his favorite, because every room felt peaceful. Margaret Donovan stopped by later that afternoon carrying a folder. "I thought you might want these." Timothy opened it. Inside rested the final court documents confirming that every provision of the divorce settlement had been completed. No remaining obligations. No unresolved filings. Everything officially closed. He smiled. "I wasn't expecting these today." Margaret looked around the house. "You've done good work here." "I've had good teachers," she laughed softly. "You always say that." "It's true." They sat on the porch overlooking the quiet street. Children rode bicycles nearby. Neighbors walked their dogs beneath tall oak trees. Life continued without knowing anything about courtrooms, trust documents, or forensic accountants. Margaret broke the silence. "Do you ever think about that first mediation? Sometimes." "What do you remember most?" Timothy didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the porch railing he had rebuilt by hand only weeks after moving in. Finally, he spoke. "Not the documents. Not the arguments." Margaret waited. "I remember signing the papers." She nodded. "You surprised everyone." "I wasn't trying to." "No. You were simply ready." Timothy smiled faintly. "For years people have said I won because I owned the house." He shook his head. "That isn't true." Margaret looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "I didn't win because of one house. I won years earlier, when I decided that discipline mattered more than appearances." Margaret smiled. "I hoped you'd say something like that." He continued quietly. "If I'd spent my life trying to look successful, I probably would have lost everything that actually mattered." The words lingered between them. Later that week, Timothy received another letter. This one came from Horizon Commercial Property Management. Inside was a simple certificate recognizing 20 years of service. No large bonus, no elaborate ceremony, just sincere appreciation from people who had watched him solve problems every day without asking for recognition. Frank Delaney presented it during a staff meeting. "I've worked with Tim for 2 decades. He looked around the room. "I've never seen him raise his voice. I've never seen him blame someone else for a mistake. And I've never seen him ask anyone to do work he wouldn't do himself." The room filled with quiet applause. Timothy accepted the certificate with visible embarrassment. "Thank you." He paused. "I've been lucky to work with good people." Jason laughed from the back of the room. "That's exactly what we knew you'd say." Everyone smiled. Nothing about the moment reflected wealth. There were no discussions about trusts, no mention of investment properties, only respect earned one ordinary day at a time. That evening, Timothy drove home along the Fox River. As he stopped at a traffic light, he noticed a familiar street sign, Maple Ridge Drive. Without thinking, he turned. The neighborhood looked much the same. Children played basketball in a driveway. Fresh mulch surrounded the flower beds. The maple trees had grown taller. He slowed as he passed the house that had once been his home. A young family now lived there. 2 bicycles rested beside the garage. A little girl chased bubbles across the front lawn while her father laughed nearby. Timothy smiled. The house had never belonged to memories. It belonged to the people building new ones. He continued driving without stopping. There was nothing left to reclaim, nothing left to prove. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, he thought back to the morning that had changed everything. The polished oak conference table, the divorce papers, the expensive suits, the confident assumptions. Everyone in that room believed the quiet maintenance supervisor had already lost. No one realized that long before the first signature touched the page, Timothy had prepared for uncertainty with patience instead of panic. He never needed dramatic speeches. He never needed revenge. He allowed the truth to arrive in its own time. The certified property records had not defeated anyone. They had simply revealed reality. And reality required no raised voice, only evidence. Timothy turned onto the road leading home. The porch light came into view, warm, steady, waiting. For the first time in many years, he understood that success was never measured by the house someone believed he owned. It was measured by the quiet confidence of knowing exactly who he was long before anyone else finally saw it. Life has a quiet way of revealing what appearances often hide. It is easy to judge someone by a job title, a paycheck, a car, or the clothes they wear. Those things are visible. Character is not. Patience is not. Discipline is not. Timothy never defeated assumptions by arguing with them. He defeated them by living consistently until the truth could speak for itself. In the end, documents proved ownership, but years of integrity proved the kind of man he had always been. Perhaps you've experienced something similar in your own life. Maybe you've been underestimated because of your profession, your background, or the way you choose to live. Or perhaps you've realized, like Eleanor, that first impressions and outward success can sometimes hide what truly matters. Every relationship is built on trust, respect, and the willingness to understand another person beyond appearances. If this story reminded you of a moment when someone underestimated you, or when you discovered the truth about someone only after it was too late, share your experience in the comments. I'd also love to know what country you're watching from, and what your local time is as you're reading this. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about quiet strength, patience, and justice, be sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's story explores another unforgettable moment, where calm preparation proves stronger than pride, and where the truth changes everything when it finally comes to light.